Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you on the open lecture of Professor Mario Cerasoli from La Sapienza University in Rome. Professor Cerasoli is our partner from 10 years already. We know each other. First time as a visiting professor, usually at conferences as a key speaker or moderator of sessions or member of the scientific board of different conferences we organized throughout this 10 years, and vice versa. We visited professor virtually in Rome on a conference. About the topic of the lecture, professor will say himself. As I said, he's a professor of La Sapienza University in Rome, previously Roma Tre, but also cooperating with different universities worldwide in Latin America, in Europe, in Barcelona, and participating in many research programs and also educational programs on master and PhD levels, both in Italy, Spain, and in Latin America. So I'm very happy that finally we can host Professor Cerasoli as a visiting professor at Krakowskiej University of Technology. So, Professor, floor is yours. You can start your lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mateusz, and good evening. And I am very happy to share this presentation with you. And but before starting my lecture, I would like to begin with a brief reflection which may help you understand why I will talk about fragile territories and secondary railways. Over the last 6 years, we have experienced and are still experiencing dramatic events of global proportion that are profoundly reshaping our way of life. The COVID pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. But mobility is perhaps one of the sectors most deeply affected by this transformation, as societies increasingly seek more sustainable and less energy-intensive models. Paradoxically, within this transition, we are rediscovering the strategic role of one of the oldest modern means of transport, the railway. This concerns not only high-speed systems, but also local public transport and secondary railway networks capable of serving territories that are now partly forgotten. So, I start by talking about the relationship between infrastructure, mobility, and territory, before focusing first on fragile territories, what they are, and secondary railways. And finally, I would focus on the specific case study I would like to present to you, the territorial master plan for the proposed reactivation of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railway. First, there is a well-established relationship between infrastructure, mobility, mobiles, and territory, as demonstrated by decades of research. Mobility patterns depend on factors such as time, cost, safety, and comfort, as well as the availability of infrastructure. Infrastructure in turn structures settlement system and shapes territorial development. In particular, patterns of land use generate movement between different areas. The need for mobility creates transport demand, which is addressed through the development of transport infrastructure. Infrastructure improves accessibility, which in turn increases land values and ultimately reshapes land use pattern. This perspective is particularly relevant when analyzing Italy's fragile or peripheral territories, the so-called inner areas, and their relationship between secondary railways, those lines, certainly not fast, that cross them. Over recent decades, many of these territories have experienced depopulation, declining accessibility, and the progressive reduction of railway service, generating a vicious cycle of marginalization. Let's now try to understand what fragile territories are, how they're formed, and what dynamics influenced them. The map you see is the synthesis of a complex classification produced in 2022 by the National Institute of Statistics, Italian National Institute of Statistics, which used a series of indicators to measure the fragility of the Italian territory, and below is the link where you can explore the indicators in individual regions. This map highlights how central and southern Italy is more fragile than northern Italy. But the story to be told is much longer than this. In Italy, areas characterized by high environmental, social, and economic vulnerability, often accompanied by exposure to natural risk and long-term processes of depopulation, are defined as fragile territories. Following the Second World War, major investments were directed towards reconstruction, also in the infrastructure sector. This phase, marked by a strong socioeconomic boost and the collective expectation, coincided with the gradual emergence of new mobility models, closely linked to broader cultural transformation across the Western world, which rapidly led to the replacement of the rail transport by private car use. Okay. Sorry. Between the mid-50s and the mid-60s, three seemingly unrelated events acted as catalysts for a profound transformation in lifestyle, settlement patterns, and mobility models. First, the beginning of regular television broadcasts by the Italian public television in 1944. The launch of the Fiat 600 in 1955 and the construction of the Sun Highway, the Autostrada del Sole, between 1956 and 1964, connecting Milan and Naples. 85% of the Italian highway network was built between the late 50s and the late 70s, when the oil crisis linked to the Israeli-Egyptian Yom Kippur War put an end to the program. But the most striking thing about those 2 decades is that the growth curve for the number of cars registered in Italy is incredibly identical to that of the number of television subscriptions, but also the absolute number, which means 1 television equals 1 car in a family. The spread of private cars and the road infrastructure progressively replaced rail as the dominant mobility model, while secondary railways increasingly lost strategic relevance. This transformation contributed simultaneously to the abandonment of many inner and small municipalities, the decline of historic centers, the growth of suburbanization and urban sprawl, and From the 90s onwards, also driven by European policies to liberalize the railway market, these processes have intensified due to the concentration of investment along the main transport corridors, above all the high-speed railways, and the consequent reduction in service on secondary lines. To address these critical imbalances, in 2014, the Italian Agency for Territorial Cohesion launched the National Strategy for Inner Areas, aimed at revitalizing the most fragile and peripheral territories through improved accessibility and territorial regeneration, as well as reducing demographic decline and marginalization. The definition of inner areas, conceived, as I said, in 2014 by the Agency of Territorial Cohesion, and it's based on accessibility levels measured through travel time by car from the center of a small municipality to the center of a municipality providing essential service, the hub. According to the subsequent ranking of Italian municipalities drawn up in 2014 and updated in 2020, inner areas in green on this map today account for almost 60% of the national territory, but they are inhabited by only 27% of the overall population. But we must not also forget that Italy's inner areas are closely linked to the physical geography of our territory, which is made up of 35% mountains, 41% hills, and only 23% plains and valley. This condition has historically influenced the development of transport infrastructure, making railway construction more complex than in other European regions. Nevertheless, following national unification in 1861, when the still fragmented pre-unification network was just over 2,000 kilometers, the construction of national railway network was conceived as a key instrument for territorial integration, aiming to ensure widespread accessibility across all the country. Within 70 years, Italy developed an extensive and capillary railway network, expanding it to over 23,000 kilometers by the late 30s, the maximum extension reached. And despite the rail speed records achieved in 1956, the average operating speed of the network remained relatively low overall, precisely due to the morphological constraints and technological limits. However, this network ensured high levels of accessibility even in peripheral areas, contributing significantly to the structuring of local settlement system and economic development. After the Second World War, nevertheless, fragmented reconstruction strategies and growing car dependency led to the progressive dismantling of main secondary line. And starting from the 1950s onwards, secondary railways in Italy have been subject to repeated cuts. Under the so-called dry branch policy, since the 50s, almost 24% of the total rail network has been closed or suspended, with significant impact on inner areas. These closures were often justified economically, but they also reflected the absence of integrated territorial planning. In recent years, especially after the COVID pandemic, the revitalization of inner areas has returned to the center of political and scientific debate. In this context, secondary railways are increasingly interpreted not only as transport infrastructure, but also as a potential drivers of territorial regeneration. Their reactivation can promote sustainable mobility, improve accessibility, strengthen local economies, support tourism and slow mobility, reduce territorial inequalities, and counteract depopulation. In this broader perspective, secondary railways can become an essential tool for more resilient development models in fragile territories, while ensuring the right to mobility. Within this framework, the reactivation of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte Railway, closed between 1971 and 1994, represents a particularly significant example. Let's start by getting to know the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte Railway territories, known as Southern Tuscia, assessing whether it can be considered a fragile area and identifying its resources and critical issues. The Southern Tuscia territory, crossed by the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte Railway, is characterized by a rich endowment of environmental, landscape, and historical cultural resources, forming a complex and stratified historical framework. A rich endowment which includes, among other things, the Alum Corris in Allumiere, the Etruscan necropolis of Blera, the railway bridge built by the FL company of the Rio Vicano in Ronciglione, Palazzo Farnese, designed by Sangallo and Vignola in Caprarola, the Corges of Corchiano, and the Ducal Castle of Gallese. But at the same time, despite all this, it can be defined as a fragile territory marked by low settlement density and a relatively limited population, just over 55,000 inhabitants, rising to approximately 117,000 inhabitants when including the terminal nodes of Civitavecchia and Orte municipalities. Although not exclusively linked to the history of our railway, this territory has exhibited significant demographic variation over time, which can be summarized as follows. The western municipalities, Allumiere, Tolfa, Monte Romano, Blera, Barbarano Romano, and Veiano, characterized by complex topography affecting accessibility and where railway service finished in 1961, have experienced a progressive population decline, minus 6% between 1961 and 2025, in contrast with the overall growth of the province of Viterbo. The central municipalities, Capranica, Sutri, Ronciglione, and Caprarola, characterized by high accessibility by railway and expressways, were our railway service finished in 1994, recorded significant population growth, more 40% in the same years. And the Ester municipalities, Fabbrica di Roma, Corchiano, and Gallese, characterized by relatively favorable morphology and good accessibility, also by railway and expressways, also recorded substantial demographic growth, more 66%, despite the closure of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte line in 1994. From a purely financial perspective, these statistics might not justify a major infrastructure investment for railway reactivation. However, the strategic relevance of our line has been recognized at the regional level, as demonstrated by its inclusion in the 2020 Regional Mobility, Transport and Logistics Plan of Lazio region. The reactivation proposal therefore goes beyond a sectoral or purely transport-oriented logic, and is grounded in an integrated territorial vision, closely linked to the objective of territorial rebalancing and sustainable mobility. In fact, in these territories where dispersed settlement prevail, today's mobility patterns are largely car-dependent. In the 55% of the municipalities along the railway, the number of cars for 1,000 inhabitants exceeds both the average of the province of Viterbo and the nearby metropolitan city of Rome. This reflects not only a widespread reliance of private vehicles, but also a structural lack of efficient alternatives in medium and low density contexts characterized by accessibility gaps. This condition further validates the strategic necessity of the railway reactivation within an integrated mobility framework. To better understand the evolution of these territories, is essential to retrace the sinusoidal, not to say contradictory, history of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railway. The origin of our railway dates back to the Papal States, when a strategic link was conceived to connect the port of Civitavecchia with the port of Ancona in the Adriatic Sea. However, several decades and multiple revisions were required before the final project was approved in 1922. Characterized by many technical and geographical challenges, the line, necessitated by the complex morphology of the terrain, it was inaugurated in 1928 and became operational in 1929. After surviving the Second World War, the railway remained in operation until 1961, when a relatively minor landslide obstruction and tunnel, combined with the increasing diffusion of private motorization and challenging mobility patterns, led to the closure of the Civitavecchia-Capranica section. Despite a partial restoration and upgrading works carried out between 1986 and 1994, including tunnels, bridges, and track bed rehabilitation, but without reinstating the rails, the decline continued, and in 1994, the remaining Capranica-Orte section was also closed. Since then, the reactivation of the line has remained a recurring objective for local communities, associations, and public local administration, although characterized by uncertainty and discontinuity in implementation. After the authorization for the decommissioning of the Civitavecchia-Capranica section, the west section, in 2011 by the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport, a turning point occurred in 2012 when the railway was included in the TNT Trans-Europe Network Scandinavian Mediterranean Corridor. Italfer, the engineering and railway construction company of the Italian Railways Company Group, developed the project for the restoration of the railway between the port of Civitavecchia and the TNT network at Orte. The project envisaged the preservation of the original line, the original alignment, the electrification, the freight-oriented reclassification, and the removal of the level crossing. In 2017, the line was classified as a tourist railway under Law 128 of 2017, promoting the reuse of deserted lines in areas of high environmental and cultural value. In 2020, the full reactivation and electrification project was included in the Regional Mobility, Transport and Logistics Plan of Lazio. The project received regional funding in 2022, even if construction has not yet started. More recently, in 2025, preliminary maintenance activities were undertaken on part of the line from Capranica to Ronciglione to enable temporary use for heritage tourist train service. So, the reactivation of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railway, estimated to cost between 500 and 700 million of euro, is once again under discussion as both a passenger and freight infrastructure capable of reconnecting southern Tuscia. This requires a comprehensive strategy based on integrated spatial planning, the reorganization of local mobility systems, and effective cooperation among municipalities, provinces, and regional authorities. Since 2021, several research and experimental teaching activities have been carried out at Sapienza University and Roma Tre University on the topic on the reactivating the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railway. These activities have enabled the development of an integrated and multi-scale territorial master plan for the entire railway line. A detailed model of the railway territorial system was developed, which allowed for the definition of a strategic territorial project, a territorial master plan, which has identified objectives, strategies, and actions related to the reactivation project of Italfer. The master plan's multi-scalar and intersectoral approach follows the most recent experiments in integrated planning oriented towards territorial resilience, such as translated development adapted to non-metropolitan contexts. Its three main strategic pillars are: first, the coordinated reorganization of local public transport. This includes the comprehensive redesign of the bus routes currently operated by the regional public bus operator, with the aim of integrating them with the rail corridors rather than duplicating them. The creation of a local public transport circuits connecting small groups of associated municipalities in order to guarantee accessibility both to railway station and to essential service. Second, the integration and redistribution of public service at the territorial scale through the identification of new facilities in the fields of healthcare and education. Proposed actions include the reactivation of Ronciglione Hospital, closed in the late 90s, including an emergency department. A new healthcare facility in Blera included a first aid unit, thus completing the integrated territorial health system. A new upper secondary school complex, also in Blera, thereby reducing the need for unnecessary daily travel. And third, the enhancement of the area's extensive landscape and historical cultural heritage. In this perspective, railway stations are reinterpreted not only as an interchange nodes, but also as gateways to the parks, while ecological and environmental corridors are identified among the different protected landscape and natural reserves. Municipal integrated programs complement this framework by adapting general strategies to the local specificities and maximize the effect resulting from the reactivation of our railway. Together, this instrument transforms railway reactivation into a broader territorial development strategy capable of mobilizing local resources and attracting new investment on the basis of clear and transparent rules. It was at this point that it became necessary to identify an innovative mechanism to make the planning system effective, minimizing the risk of failure to implement the actions. From a procedural perspective, in fact, the implementation of the integrated programs requires an equally advanced implementation and management mechanism, which is identified in the Axis contract. As an operational and management tool for the territorial master plan and the integrated programs, the Axis contract identifies the various public and private stakeholders involved in the territorial project, defining roles, responsibilities, and binding commitment for each. It also establishes the planning, programming, and management components of the intervention in a single administrative process, ensuring their implementation within specific timeframes and methods. This instrument, inspired by the French contract docs of the early 2000s, is also based on local community participation, thereby reducing the distance between technical decision-making and the social recognition of the territorial transformation. Its purpose is to integrate transport and spatial planning, coordinate multiple institutional actors, involve local communities, and strengthen social legitimacy. In this sense, the Axis contract represents an innovative governance instrument for the reactivation of our railway, capable of our territory, capable of combining sustainable mobility, territorial cohesion, and local development, particularly relevant in the context of inner areas and fragile territories. To conclude, at a time when it becomes imperative to rethink our mobility models, and with them our ways of living, a return to this ancient modern form of transport, such as the railway, should not be an option, but a necessity. Secondary railways, when reinterpreted as enabling infrastructure, can play a key role for territorial cohesion. In this perspective, they can reduce accessibility deficit, support sustainable mobility, strengthen local economies, and promote social and territorial resilience. The case of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railways demonstrates how railway reactivation may function not merely as transport policy, but as an integrated territorial project. The territorial master plan, integrated programs, and Axis contract together offer a potentially replicable methodological framework for other fragile territories. From a broader perspective, the experience of the Civitavecchia-Capranica-Orte railway can be a methodological reference for intervention also in Poland on other underused or abandoned secondary railway lines, and contributes to the definition of a new paradigm for governing inner and fragile territories based on accessibility, institutional cooperation, and the right of mobility. And so, with this prototype of high-speed cat, I can conclude. Thank you for your patience and attention.